Why is our assumption of fantasy that it takes place in medieval Europe? Well, this time, the answer's not Tolkien. It's a little more complicated than that, and raises quite a few questions about our world-building assumptions. This is my case for abandoning all pretense of medievalism, and widening the scope of the historical tools in our toolbox, while also suggesting that for the most part, we aren't really telling medieval tales in fantasy at all. Do hear me out, because this topic is utterly fascinating, and I hope I can convince you of at least some part of my argument. So I wouldn't be the first person to point out that our medieval fantasy assumption is in actuality a cobbled together mess of historical artifacts all the way from the 8th century to the 18th. Tall ships and rapiers exist alongside Norsemen and hand axes in some settings, which really pushes the medievalism to a breaking point. The term medieval is already quite wide-ranging in its use, and is more nowadays used to denote a specific vibe of serfs working the fields to placate their liege lords, ready at any point to be called into the king's armies to fight in some monumental power struggle over territory. It's a very European way of looking at things, and generally refers to the late and high medieval periods, where the aesthetic is more geared towards a knight in shining armour on horseback than a collection of farmers holding a spear wall in a battle line. This is not to blame anyone at all. Fantasy is just that. It's supposed to be fantastical, and to tell interesting, dynamic stories of change, heroism and high drama. But what's always bothered me is if we want stories that are fantastic, set in worlds filled with change and drama, why on earth do we assume as our base a period of European history categorised by long, drawn-out wars over territorial disputes, making miles at a time and losing them the next campaign year? Even if you do happen to be into that, you must admit it's been done fairly often. Now, it is my opinion that most fantasy creatives know full well that the late medieval-ish fantasy zeitgeist is not necessarily the greatest place to focus on stories of dramatic change and high-octane exploratory adventure. This is evidenced by the simple fact that some of the genre-defining works of fantasy itself don't themselves take too much time to get into the weeds of yearly army raising and the medieval simulationism that is so commonly touted as excellent storytelling. Starting with the grandfather of it all, we have Tolkien, who uses a strange mixture of historical entities to populate his world of Middle-earth, which, in my mind, is actually pretty far from the Middle Ages. We have the Shire, based on a rural idyll of turn-of-the-century English countryside, replete with brass buttons and clocks on mantelpieces. This in turn is contrasted with Isengard, which is a newly industrialised war machine focused on forging and smelting weapons for the fight, on a grand, unprecedented scale. This presentation certainly evokes the Industrial Revolution, even assuming that Lord of the Rings itself isn't a wholesale critique of industrialisation. Tolkien is very careful to keep Middle-earth's place in history, if it even has one, deliberately vague. He refuses to describe in any great detail the technology of the world, all the way from siege weaponry to armour and armaments. So the fact that we keep jumping back to a kind of medieval assumption as classic fantasy is somewhat strange when Tolkien is referred to as the forefather of many of our fantastic conventions. Now, Tolkien did, of course, borrow from Germanic myth and legend, which would count in the early medieval period to some extent, with his elves and dwarves. And he also imports many Anglo-Saxon touchstones into Rohan, although it must be noted that the Angles were definitely not comfortable warring on horseback. This places the inspiration for Rohan and some of the more magical elements of the world firmly in a kind of medieval era, assuming we're not using that much maligned term, the Dark Ages. In truth, Tolkien's Middle-earth is a hodgepodge of various historical influences, which helps maintain its timeless mystique and a kind of verisimilitude as a totally separate world from our own. As a stark contrast, George R.R. Martin very candidly and clearly focuses on evoking a specific medieval setting in A Song of Ice and Fire. This setting, of course, being the Wars of the Roses, while some portions of his world, most immediately Essos and Dorne, don't necessarily fit into the mould of British history. Such cultures do have rough European contemporaries in the Mongols of the steppes and the Moriscos of southern Spain. Unlike Tolkien, Martin moors his world in history by discussing the significance of arms and armaments and siege weaponry specifically in his books. We even see tourneys and tourney lances, which gives us a massive hint as to which part of the medieval period we're supposed to be looking at. Martin has a specific slice of the historical medieval period that he is interested in, the mid to late 15th century, and he goes in for it. He takes the admittedly fascinating developments, setting and politicking straight from a relatively small period of historical time, and moves that into a fantastical sense. A general assumption among fantasy fans and world builders is that magic is the cause for a stagnation of technological advancement, leaving worlds in a perpetual medieval-ish limbo. This is often given as the reason why late medieval technology is about the limit that many writers are willing to go to in their world building, excepting of course tall ships and pirates and firearms, which do often show up a surprising amount, considering the unwillingness to engage with anything beyond medieval, aesthetically at least. I get it. Fantasy is supposed to be fantastical, and it may seem like I'm nitpicking here about anachronisms of how our history is possibly incompatible with the invented history of a world with dragons and magic. This is a fair criticism, but I do still have two pressing questions. Assuming that magic and its use does indeed cause an eventual stagnation of the scientific and technological processes, why are we choosing to stop in the medieval era or a little later, depending on your specific style? What's the point of developing plate armour if some mage or some dragon is going to cook you alive inside it? Why work so long on smelting, forging and smithing a great long sword, when a punching dagger is just as likely, if not more likely, to get you in between the scales of a dragon's hide? And speaking of fantasy monsters, why the heck would you go around forging a whole chain shirt when you could just be harvesting the natural armour on some giant lizard or similar creature? The point is, in a world of magic and monsters, who's to say we get the chance to develop more complex technology than, say, the Bronze Age? And who's to say that's a bad thing? A fantasy world that has not yet been through an industrial revolution is just as likely to look like the Bronze Age ancient world as some high medieval knights in shining armour. After all, giants, chimera, sphinx, nagas, and even Tiamat and Bahamut all come from this Bronze Age era of human history. It's my conjecture that the best epic fantasy, not necessarily fantastical political intrigue, takes place on the frontier, the border between civilization and the beyond. And a scarcity of civilization, mixed with limited weapons technology, leads to a far more interesting setting in that specific regard. The mythic past. Small bastions of people, under leaders still chosen for their charisma and military prowess, not some familial line stretching back for millennia. I mean, goodness me, it's not even like our most popular or enduring set of ancient mythology is itself a well-engaged with fantasy setting. Relatively little fantasy media engages in Hellenistic history, or the myriad creatures and monsters that come out of the pages of ancient Greek mythology, which still manages to nonetheless be a mainstay in many other genres of fiction. It's a shame, really. I find that having a little space out in the world truly given over to the wild, with no fortification or civilization laying claim to it, is a really good way to bring a wild, monstrous feeling to a world. A true frontier feeling, and a feeling of exploration and high adventure. Equally, why does our medieval fantasy construction like to stop itself immediately before everything gets a heck of a lot more complex? In many imaginings, the medieval period ends at the end of the mid to late 15th century. This is true in Spain as well, but they're a little more clear about what exact date marks the end of medieval Spain. 1492. This is partly for political reasons, because it is the date when Spain is able to properly assert itself as a nation, having completed the Reconquista of Granada. But it's also because the world around Spain had unmistakably changed in 1492. A new frontier had been discovered, the Americas, and Spain was about to get very much involved. The panicked grab for land and resources that would follow was one of the most dynamic periods of international history. It saw an incredible amount of progress and travel in a short time, both east and west, I might add, and gives rise to immense political infighting, the age of sail, and indeed the age of piracy, eventually. Pirates, their trappings and customs, fictionalized or not, are massively influential in a lot of fantasy media, not least for how many of our roguish characters dress, and certainly in creating a picture of what sailing looked like to a modern audience. The point is that by investing your fantasy world with something new, an event that shakes up the status quo, you can almost certainly guarantee that conflicts and alliances become immediately more fraught than even when Europe was undergoing its seasonal turf wars. Besides, depending on the power of magic in your world, it makes sense that these matters are of truly international importance. If mages are capable of travelling vast distances almost instantly, or sending immediate messages around the globe, see my video on the world-building impacts of the sending spell in Dungeons & Dragons for a little more on that, by the way, then your world is an international one, whether you like it or not, especially if all of these nations are competing over the same prize. Your world can certainly be stifled in progress by magic or by monsters. That's perfectly reasonable as an assumption in a fantasy world. But why stop that progress right when we have knights and lords and kings and all of that malarkey? You see, The biggest issue with much of medieval European fantasy, in how it's presented and much of how the medieval Europe operated, is that there wasn't any room, really, for individual determinism or for social mobility. Yes, it was possible to win your way through the ranks of the king's army until you became a landed knight. But did that allow you the freedom to run your land the way you want? To act as you see fit? Of course not. The strict hierarchical structure of feudalism in medieval Europe meant, realistically, that everybody answered to someone else, all the way up, technically, to the Pope, who himself answered to God. Our idea of an independent, plucky group of heroes moving out into the world with the intention of saving it tends to fall apart pretty quickly once we realise that at their every turn they would be interrupted by bureaucracy and borders, unless they've already secured safe passage for themselves in advance and are acting on behalf of some powerful liege lord, who would probably have to be contacted first to give his blessing to their heroic grand quest. At best, our fantasy heroes would need a very powerful backer, and would also need to kowtow and ingratiate themselves at every single court they pass through to ensure that their journey can even continue through other people's lands. And that's even assuming that the powerful backer will even agree to give them funding for this madcap quest. All of this doesn't really leave much room for the actual heroism or adventure. Fantasy medievalism, then, is filled with wild anachronisms already. From styles of dress to styles of building. And even this rampant individualism that was certainly not able to be present in the medieval period. To all intents and purposes, then, the medieval fantasy is, with some exceptions in Martin and those who take history very seriously indeed, is filled, then, with 18th century concepts. Heck, in Dungeons & Dragons, the rapier is a weapon of choice alongside hand axes and longswords. So why not incorporate firearms and explosives? A lot of our uninterrogated, tacit fantasy assumptions, especially the individualism thing, make a lot more sense when we actually age up the world into the 18th century. Because the medieval fantasy isn't medieval. It's about as medieval as a Ren fair. And that is fine. It serves a purpose, allows us to create a general abstraction of history so that we're not bogged down in the details, and provides the backdrop for some very interesting fantasy stories that have been told throughout our history. It's just worth pointing out that it really isn't medieval. But if we're going so far as to incorporate all of these things from the Age of Sail, the Age of Piracy, and the Enlightenment, why don't we just lean into it? You see, I happen not to agree that a world with magic would create a situation where our technical achievements are left out to dry. Just speaking from a human perspective here, if even 20% of people can cast magic, manipulate the laws of nature itself, which is more than in most fantasy settings, by the way, the other 80% wouldn't just be sitting on their thumbs. They'd be jealous. Sure, many of them will silently sieve, but the rest will find ways to make their crafts or goods in a way that is at least approaching what the mages can do. Or maybe even better through specialisation and innovation. Are we really expected to believe that just because our basic needs are met through the elimination of famine, for example, or elimination of disease through magic, that nobody's gonna do anything? Invent anything? Ever? Rubbish. Besides, judicious application of magic will make some of the discoveries of our past and our industrial revolutions Even easier to come by. Can your magic heat to a consistent temperature? Excellent. Smelting, refining, and glassmaking all just became a hell of a lot easier. You can move earth or stone en masse? Oh, amazing. A fort takes a quarter of the time to set up. Mining is far less dangerous and far more profitable. And massive roads can be put up in days to link disparate communities to each other by easy and quick transport links. Your mages can teleport? Marvellous. The world is mapped in its entirety. No strange exploratory surprises like New Zealand or America. Two men working on the same problem on opposite sides of the world are able to collaborate in near perfect harmony. This is not even mentioning that mages would of course be tinkering with the fabric of magic as well, and may even luck into or stumble into an industrialization boom all on their own. The greatest stories are told in the midst of change, which is why I find it baffling that so many creatives tend to stick to a staid setting without significant or dramatic recent development. I understand not wanting to envision the consequences of a magic system becoming used for some magical industrial revolution a la Pratchett, although there is an excellent supplement, at least for TTRPGs, by Skirples called Magical Industrial Revolution, which does a lot of that world building work for you. But you can at the very least throw in an international resource struggle, a gold rush, or a steadily won or reclaimed frontier to make your world that much more dynamic. Bonus points if this resource struggle isn't for the super special main character who has talents that have never been seen before. It's nice to have more than one conflict going on at once. I could talk for days about my distaste for this trope that magic somehow causes a laziness and stagnation in progress, and maybe I will if enough of you ask for it, but for now I think we'd best leave it there. I implore you, consider other periods of history and other cultures as your main inspiration for fantasy. From the Bronze Age to the Enlightenment, there are many more stories that can be told that don't include dingy castles and daring knights. The future is not medieval. I hope you've enjoyed this look into the topic. I clearly haven't been able to cover everything, and my points are necessarily filled with some rather broad statements. Yes, certain aspects of history are necessarily underrepresented here, and my aim has been to inform on a broad overview, not to give a lecture on medieval civic dynamics. Regardless, please do let me know if I'm wildly off base on any of this. I appreciate the discussion on each one of my videos like this, and it helps inform, I think, all of us on where our assumptions may just be simply wrong, or where disagreements can legitimately be had. And make sure to let me know if you want more on this topic, especially on covering a magical industrial revolution. With that said though, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the Grungeon Master, and I will see you in the next video.